just nice to have got into this place. I wanted to thank the people who made it happen. But yes, and thanks also Jabu and Sukant coming down for this discussion on kind of reflecting back on the last 3 years in particular of Black Lives Matter, the summer 2020, the events, significance of them, and kind of the future for the movement. BLM UK, the official group, has sort of just decided to cease operations just a couple of weeks ago. So might kind of touch on that a little bit. But yeah, I'm not going to waffle on anymore. I'm just going to, Jabu's going to speak for however long she wants to speak for. Oh, you're going to go first. Okay, Sugan's going to speak, and then Jabu, and then we'll just open it up and we can just discuss. So, yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you, everyone. Just like to congratulate you on your action to take over this building. It's really important that we directly, independently, in a radical grassroots way, challenge the colonial capitalist system and take space and do beautiful things with it. In so doing, showing the community and ourselves that we're more than able to take over these types of buildings and deliver projects to the grassroots with no budget, with just love and passion and drive and commitment and loyalty to the most oppressed in our communities. Please join us, grab a chair from inside or just perch, whatever. Yeah. So my name is Sukant, I'm part of the Malcolm X movement. I'm not going to talk about my political history. I don't want to take too much time. We can talk informally later, or etc. Thank you, Jabu, for accepting the opportunity to have a conversation with you and everyone here. I hope you do speak on record. If you don't, that's fine. But I think it's important your voices get out there to a wider audience. So I'm recording to upload on YouTube later, so if you don't want to be included, just let me know. I can edit it out or just whatever. It's an audio recording. Anyway, so to talk to the point, in the summer of 2020, the quote-unquote Black Lives Matter upsurge following the disgusting and horrific racist police killing of George Floyd, which itself led to a 2-week uprising in Minneapolis, which was very inspiring. And really, without that uprising, I don't think there would have been the type of global surge against white supremacy racism that there was through those summer months. So just respect and honor and solidarity to George Floyd's friends and family. So that uprising was really important. Now, you have to understand the wider context of what's going on here. I haven't prepared, so I'm just kind of off the cuff. So that's why I'm kind of closing my eyes and just trying to really understand how to put all this together, because it's complex and we've got a limited amount of time. So we're talking about the summer of 2020. So what's the social, political, cultural context globally, and particularly for us here in Southern England or on this island in general? So it's obviously during the first lockdown of the pandemic. And that was a very emotional and difficult time for everyone. I'm not strictly anti-lockdown, although I don't agree with the way the Tories handled that at all. There was an anti-lockdown movement, which I think my position was that radical left grassroots forces, of which if they had any capacity, should be going into the anti-lockdown movement forcibly by any means necessary, removing the far right and right-wing leadership off it and taking it over in a framework of radical resistance, but also taking responsibility around public health for our grassroots around the pandemic which happened. And the Malcolm X movement put that into operation around a few council estates in that summer, which is an important part of this story. So that's really important. The lockdown, the alienation, the horrific racism, and the way that the elderly were targeted, the people in the care homes were targeted, that the disproportionate migrant, Asian and African labor diaspora here was thrown into that pandemic. Infamously, that poor, I think, West African heritage sister lost her life at Victoria Station, that you probably remember. Ty, who was considerable, yes, good to see you, brother. Please join in. Good to have Nigel Carter here with us, also a significant person in the history of the black resistance grassroots in our country.
A few more chairs.
With the Sun Ra t-shirt, big it up, yes. There's some really nice things. We have the sister with the great earrings over there, the hammer and sickle. Anyway, so where was I? Remind me. Oh yes, the racism in the pandemic and the lockdown, pushing poor migrant labor to the front line, disproportionate deaths around that. That's still an ongoing legacy that we're struggling for justice. It's also on the back of a number of historic victories for the right and the far right, which gets embedded into the British government and state for the first time, employing policies which will make the National Front blush. The Rwanda policy, the hostile environment, quote unquote, that Theresa May started, also on the back, it has to be said, of what happened in 2011, which is significant. Come in, sit down. So, you know, it's what Stuart Hall, the radical cultural theorist from Jamaica, says. It's the great moving right show, to quote directly. He says this from the 80s, and that's what we've been faced with. Arguably since the late 60s, early 70s, globally, it's been successively, despite moments of resistance and victories, in general, it's been a victory of the right since the 1970s. And that was pushed forward into the 80s, into the 90s, which was the decade of total collapse at the grassroots here, in where our historical radical grassroots just fall apart in many different ways. We can go into that. And then we go into the new Labour government, which is also, it's the neoliberal, that's the right-wing colonial capitalist consensus, called the Washington Consensus at the time. The slogans were war on terror, a very racist and colonial militaristic period. It was full spectrum dominance, shock and awe, which was the hubris of colonial violence increasingly across the world, not least exemplified in the horrors of the repression against the Palestinians, although with respect to their resistance and their uprising in the Second Intifada, the invasion and destruction of the Iraqi society led by London and Washington. The Iraqi resistance were a major important role in this period of history. The attack on Zimbabwe around the land seizure issues of the white settler farmers, in which we know now that Blair wanted to conduct onto Zimbabwe what he delivered onto Iraq, and it was only because of the ANC, and I'm no big fan of the ANC currently, but we know it was ANC and Thabo Mbeki who says, Blair, you want to do that, we're not going to play with you, no thank you very much, we're not going to collaborate with that. And basically Blair knew that SADC wasn't going to go ahead with his war against Zimbabwe, and he backed off. ZANU-PF and the state, that's another problematic issue. But this is some of the context to which we go into. Then the victories of the Cameron government, it sends 5,000 people to prison for stealing bottles of water and nappies in the 4-day August 2011 uprising following the racist lynching of Mark Duggan on the historic black grassroots resistance community of the Broadwater Farm Council estate. The crews from the council estate, the working class crews from the council estate are the backbone of the working class struggle and resistance in this country since at least the 1960s, if not 1958, when Antiguan migrant Kelso Cochrane is killed in the streets of Ladbroke Grove, Notting Hill, by racists, which leads to a major upsurge in black resistance in Notting Hill, Ladbroke Grove, leading one of the greatest revolutionaries that this island has ever been blessed with, Claudia Jones from Trinidad, starting the St. Pancras Carnival as a direct black radical response to the killing of Kelso Cochrane in the late 50s, right? This is all part of our unbroken, interlinked struggle, intergenerational struggle, whether we understand it or we don't. So, Cameron, Theresa May, hostile environment, British destruction of Libya. Britain led the war against the most successful socialist state in Africa, despite our criticisms, which was the state of the Libyan Jamahiriya. 41 years of socialism, supporting Pan-Africanist projects, supporting resistance all around the world, including every radical African and Asian formation in this country was financed and backed by Muammar Gaddafi, and one of the greatest liberation armed struggles ever to have blessed this planet, and what I call the best thing that Europe ever produced, which was the Irish rebels, let's say. This is going up on YouTube, so they ban things, certain phrases, and that phrase is banned. So the great Fenian struggle. Anyway, so we go back to this, how long I've been talking. I'm going to try and wrap this up in the next 5 minutes. So then we're faced with this Brexit victory, which is bringing into the state explicitly far-right politics, okay? Until Brexit, the state never explicitly, as a government state project, adopts far-right policies, although it enacts certain far-right policies all along. The Labour government was doing so-called virginity tests to Asian migrant women at Heathrow Airport in the late 70s, you know? When Malcolm X visits Smethwick in 1963 or 4, I can't remember exactly, he went there because the Tories were running a candidate in the parliamentary election saying, if you want to end for a neighbour, vote Labour. In which the Labour Party candidate feeds into that horrific racism. That's why Malcolm X goes there and says, don't wait for the gas chambers, the grassroots, go fight back right now to both African heritage, Caribbean heritage and Asian heritage people, of which Malcolm X made no distinction and included them all within this concept of the global black revolution. Now, so Brexit, hostile environment, destruction of Libya, it was a popular war. One of those young boys that Theresa May sent off to fight for NATO in Libya came back and bombed the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester. That's all come out in the inquiry. We were telling you that in 2011 when the whole war was happening, when no one wanted to know about it, when everyone was drunk off the NATO Arab sting and supporting that mess in Libya. Hostile environment, Libya, August 2011, the lockdown, the Corbyn fiasco. I mean, I am no friend of what happened, or what Corbyn did with the leadership of the Labour Party. I've worked with Corbyn several times. I do not agree with his anti-migrant policies, his dillying and dallying in the most disgusting manner over Brexit, his support for Trident, his support for Scotland in the United Kingdom colonial union, his refusal to advocate for the removal of the British presence on the ongoing occupation of Ireland. And his probably, you know, I said to him, Corbyn, like, what are you doing with this migrant impact fund as a part of your policies? And he was like, yes, I can't. I know it sounds terrible. And I said, why are you supporting the Brexit victory? Oh, we have to respect the democratic outcome of the referendum. I said, when did leftists ever support a far-right victory at an election? And he just wanted to run away from the conversation. But, you know, the thing about that, and the reason that's important, you can like Corbyn and you can spin him positively as you want. That's fine. Go do your thing. However, what the Corbyn project did was refuse to touch the grassroots. That's an objective fact. He did not want to go to the council estates. Actually, I've got an anecdote. He actually literally came on the edge of the council estate I was resident in, and he refused to go to the community centre and speak to the young people, despite us bringing young black people to him who were inspired by what he was doing in part. So the Corbyn thing really demobilizes us, creates a mass delusion that a narrow bourgeois parliamentary strategy is a viable one for us for left-wing policies in a context of growing fascisation of the British state explicitly. And then the summer of 2020 happens. George Floyd gets martyred. The uprising in Minneapolis. And I'm going to finish off on this. Two things I'm going to talk about: the protests and the class composition of the protests and our intervention in that. The protests were happening day after day. Of course, there's the Colston statue action, and respect to the Bristol comrades for that. So we're in London, Parliament Square, Whitehall. Council estate youth are coming out every day for months, day after day after day after day. No one is organising them coming out. This is spontaneous, self-organised, black working class youth led. There were also other racialized people there, but it was led by the black youth from the council estates. They came out and they came out and they came out and they came out. Then you remember there was TSG, riot police on horses, etc. Youth fought back. As soon as youth fought back the police violence, the entire UKBLM network ran away. The Forefront Project of Temi Mwale ran away. The UKBLM, Adam Cooper and all the rest of them ran away. Just like the British colonial left, white left. Same behaviour. Once the youth get radical and fight back, they run away and they leave them to fend for themselves. We didn't run away. I've still got all the footage of the fight back on my phone. So we intervene, and this relates to the class composition of UKBLM, which is actually Eurocentric and middle class, colonial oriented, careerist, grifting political class of a community of activists. So of course they're going to be terrified of the council estate youth. They're alienated from the council estate youth. They have no real relations with them. They have no orientation with them. They have no political work towards them whatsoever. So that was going on. That culminates in June the 13th, 2020. Remember when Tommy Robinson and his DFLA said, we're going to defend the statues? Remember they put the grey box, it had to be a grey box, thank you very much, on top of Churchill? you remember that? They put a grey box on the Churchill statue. That in itself is a great victory. A grey box on the Churchill statue. So they were scared we were going to pull down this Churchill statue, and we should have, and we will tear down that statue. And so, anyway, so that's all happening. Then June the 13th, Tommy Robinson says, I'm going to go with my lad to defend the statues, or can't take this BLM stuff. Now, this relates to a more nuanced issue of how the far right and with the British state have delivered a divide and rule approach against African and Asian heritage people, targeting one and kind of trying to recruit the other. But that's a more complex story. June the 13th, do you remember UKBLM said it's a draw out, don't turn out for June the 13th. When did we not turn out when the fascists provocate? When did this ever happen? Does this ever happen? You stay at home scared and you don't come out? No, you come out. Doesn't matter if you're 10 or 20 or 50, you come out. Malcolm X movement and London Black Revs, we were the only radical left formations mobilizing for June the 13th, but the black youth were out. What's his name? Mega Man from So Solid Crew was there, and he helped to lead the black resistance on the day. These are significant cultural black radical forces. June the 13th was a historic victory against the far right of the last 20 to 30 years, and that's what was delivered in this self-organized, spontaneous black militancy. All right. So to finish off this,
very briefly remind us what happened that day.
So Tommy said, I'm going to come out. Then, Mark Duggan's crew, original farm boys from the Broadwater Farm Council estate, they put a bounty on Tommy Robinson's head. They're like, yeah, you want to come out and you want to beef us? Okay, I don't know if they put 10 grand or 100 grand on his head. Okay, here's 10 grand on his head. Now come out. What did he do? Within minutes, I'm not coming out. But his lot came out, and so we squished them. And
the BLM official demo was cancelled.
The BLM cancelled their protests. They got Anthony Joshua to tell us to sell out. They told Akala to tell us to sell out. Everyone told us to sell out on the day. And it was very, anxiety-ridden to come out when everyone is saying sell out, sell out, sell out. We took a big risk to turn up, to fight the fascists to a defeat. And that's what we did. We did it on Parliament Square, and we did it outside Waterloo Station. The footage is all there. Enjoy it. It's a great victory. But then at the same time, in parallel with that, I'm going to finish off with this, mass work, mass work, mass work, revolutionary serve the people work. We did on 2 council estates with no budget, organised 21 separate activities over the 6-week summer holiday because the local tenants association and the community centre was closed down. And so we'd self-organised, respecting PPE and kind of public safety. We're all DBS checked, etc. And we delivered 21 separate activities, self-organised by the residents. And I went around organised, said, look, this is anti-police, pro-Malcolm X, pro-Black Panther, anti-council. Everyone's like, yeah, glad to hear it. There's a radical consciousness at the grassroots that potentially can be delivered upon. And so, like veteran revolutions at the grassroots, Suresh Grover, Minka Adofo, all said we've never seen a community program this wide and this effective. And so we showed on a number of issues what can be done in terms of a direct self-defense, political advocacy, radical organizing at the grassroots, all of this, which was sold out by the so-called UK. I mean, why would you put UK in your political title? It's crazy. Anyway, by the UKBLM. So going forward now, and to finish off on this, sorry, Jabu, I've talked a bit. So going forward, that's what the challenge remains. The challenge remains is to inculcate oneself and socially into the histories of black power, radical socialist, anti-colonial grassroots histories, because that is the working class struggle history of our island. There is no other history. The other kind of, quote, white working class struggles feeds into that black-led. If there is no black-led working class struggle, there is no radicalization of the white working class, and we can go into that in a deeper way. So it's the consciousness, the history, the research, the ideologies, and then to embedding ourselves into working class estates, delivering what people need in terms of services, support, and joy and creativity, and organizing radical resistance and organizing around that. There is no other effective path to effective class struggle and revolutionary struggle. So I'm going to leave it at that. And just to finish off by saying that I think everything is vested against this political movement. We're in a very growing right-wing situation as we go forward, and so the challenges are quite hard and growing. But circles like this and the work that networks are doing in Oxford that are really important. The Blackbird Lees event that we did a few weeks ago is super. I don't think you were there. No shame you weren't there. We were expecting to be there, but we're going to do more events around that. It's really important we tap into the growing needs at the grassroots, and we are seen out of love and selflessness, not for grift, not for funding, but out for sacrifice and love, that we serve our people towards resistance and liberation. Thank you.
Nice overview of 4 decades of the travails of class struggle and revolutionary struggle in this country. Jabu, tell us whatever you want to say.
Yes, wow, you said you weren't prepared.
What's it like when you do?
Yeah.
Long.
Yeah. Okay.
In a good way.
Comprehensive, yeah.
Yeah, really good, really good. Where do I start? Well, I'm going to start with the George Floyd under the root of that horrible chauvinist, forgotten who his name is.
Chauvin, I think his name is.
Chauvin, yeah, Chauvin.
Derek Chauvin.
Yeah, Derek Chauvin. I can't breathe. It was really significant because, as I said, it can't breathe. We were in the COVID stage of being worried about people that were not breathing from COVID. And then suddenly the black politics was drived into this environment where we had to really examine where we are in terms of the political system in Oxford. I'm going to talk in the context of Oxford because then we identified that, okay, we've got Rhodes who's been kneeling on our throats for years, being displayed in the high street. We've got all sorts of issues in Oxford with police brutality, which is taking place in our council estates, and all these denials of what was happening in Oxford, which was being experienced by black people. Now, the significant march that I remember, the first one, which took place in South Park, was a mass mobilization of young black youths, and a mixture of so many people coming forward to talk about their plight. What I saw there was incredible in terms of the people that were speaking were not sort of so-called intellectuals, people who had this sort of background of speaking publicly, but people were that tired that young people came up and said, on such and such a day, I had to go through this, on such and such a day. There was a mass amount of testimony of what was happening in Oxford in terms of the racial oppression for black people. And a lot of them, as you said, they came from the estates, which I like the estate where I live, where I'm a councillor. The significance for me as of that estate as a Labour Party member was that when we were canvassing, we would be told that when they say that they are Labour Party, leave them alone, don't engage them in politics. So what took place was that the people that were marginalized rose up in my time, because Kieran was there campaigning with me that summer. They stood up and they gave me a majority, people that were seen as apolitical and mostly white. And this is a black woman in a working class area, which a lot of the Labour Party would have dismissed as the Brexiters. So going back to the BLM, why it was so significant for me to be part of this movement in terms of the protest that was being mounted. I came to England in the 80s. In the 80s, it was a time when the anti-apartheid was a big part of anti-apartheid was a big part of trying to fight apartheid in South Africa. And 1984 was significant for me because I arrived at the time when there was a miners' strike. Scargill was the biggest enemy of the media. And my mother was studying at Ruskin College, which is now, basically, I would say non-existent in terms of the times where she was, where we could get into buses and be driven to protest everywhere. The mood was really different. So growing up in that era during apartheid and seeing this Black Lives Movement, it came home. It came home to me because living in England, people would say to me, but it's not the same. It's not the same as South Africa. Here you have freedom. But I would always say, no, but it's very similar for me because black people are predominantly living in Black Bedleys. They're predominantly living in Barton. I would recognize where the poor were situated in terms of the classification of where people are in terms of incomes. So for me, it's very much like what South Africa looks like now. It's no longer has a legalized form of state hegemony, which is seen as apartheid, the Bantu Education Act, the Group Areas Act, all the acts that were keeping people in segregated areas. But the formation of the segregation is there. It's there. The status quo has been established. So for me, when I'm in South Africa, it's very much similar to this now. And that is what we are being told is now freedom. When you can see that people are living in squalor, people are living in poverty, there's a class system that has been created, and our biggest oppressors are our people now. So it's the ANC that we fought for to come and liberate us. So the Black Lives Matter, going back to the Black Lives Matter, the energy that was there, it's really important to always go back to that in terms of the type of people that it attracted and mobilized into action. I like to pay homage to Sasha Johnson. Sasha Johnson was one of the most brave young people that I saw. The energy, I knew her from Ruskin. It's like she was transformed into this warrior. We pushed the marches till the end because it got to the point where it started dwindling. But the objectives of that Oxford BLM, I would say some of them were realized because for the first time in the City Council here, Oxford City Council, we fought for the cabinet to change its formation. Before Black Lives Matter, there was never any black people on the cabinet in this Oxford we live in. There were not so many black councillors. But we went in there. But what I'm experiencing is the same can't breathe type of situation because at the end of the day, there is no power. We are, as much as we may have radical politics, some of us, but we are there in name. We are there in as tokenistic because in terms of the status quo, what is happening in Oxford is entrenched. We have the same class system. We are basically being swallowed into convention that was never part of us in terms of the democratic process. We're never part of the formation of how the council should run. In the council chamber itself, we are surrounded by statues of our oppressors, which are just mostly old white dudes that have nothing to do with, celebrating black empowerment. Even when they do mention identity politics or the George Floyd issue, it's just in passing, but not to actually radically take any action about the poverty in Oxford, what is happening in terms of inequalities in the areas we live in. I, as a councillor, in my capacity, I knock doors and I speak to people. And I've just noticed even recently that they have started following me, trying to listen to me, to what I say to people on the doorstep. Because most of the people that are classified as living in Barton are people that they are seen as non-political. They have no, just leave them alone. They have no, but when you get to speak to them, they know their agencies, they know their politics. But obviously they don't express themselves in a way that is seen as, politically informed. But they say, look at this, we are starving. We have to rely on food banks. We have to, so they understand. And even till this day, the Labour Party doesn't understand how I was able to achieve such a high majority in that area. So going back to your point, there is room to mobilize on this estate and really bring out the plight of the people that are living in the state. So once again, going back to my background, I like to not quote as such, but I like to talk about a January insurrection that I went to in South Africa, which was celebrating the 1973 strikes, which took place in the area of Durban. which is KwaZulu-Natal. Those strikes are really significant to me because that's when my mother's generations were rising up against apartheid. They are not highlighted now. The ANC government tries to obliterate those type of struggles. It's really, really interesting how a lot of the history, even although South Africa is just like almost 20 odd years, new democracy, but they're already trying to wipe out the history, even from the 80s, of the most significant people who fought in those struggles. These strikes were mostly led by people from black backgrounds who were really struggling in terms of the living wage, that they were basically slave wages that they were experiencing. But today, the way that story is being told now, it's as if intellectuals came from universities to go and tell them that, this is what your plight is, this is how you should be rising up. But it was such an incredible moment. I've recently interviewed my mother about it, who was part of those strikes. And I said, basically just trying to work out who was leading those strikes, what was happening, how did you manage to mobilize such mobilize people that were not English speakers, but also mobilize people to be able to galvanize them into action like they did, because not only did that strike is credited with actually mobilizing the townships, and then subsequently the June 16 uprising, which those strikes kind of not taught people, but they kind of began to say to people mobilizing communities that you can rise up as communities. Because when I hear from the elders, they were not only just people who were working, but people from the communities came out to join those strikes. But today they are minimized into a small little, group of white intellectuals who went into the factories and mobilized the people. So that is also very important. When I saw the pamphlet saying which way forward for the Black Lives Matter movement, there was an incident where not a couple of weeks ago, probably about 3 weeks ago, me and Nigel Carter here, we went to see a play in you were there, Usha, in Oxford Brookes University, and they basically the same sort of almost a matrix type of situation where they talk about the struggles that black people have had to endure over the years, and I learned a lot from there, because you never stop learning. There's a tendency for me to feel that my experiences have taught me to be able to resist oppression in a way that I do. But I learned that there are so many ways that we can grow as a people. Nigel introduced me to Lewis Gordon, who talks about the resistance and the oppression, how black people have resisted over the years. So I am deeply now encouraging young people to read and learn more about our history, because even though we can sort of try and articulate what is happening with our lives, everyday lives, but without an understanding of how to analyze the history and be able to say, yes, this took place, Maurice Bishop in Grenada this year, you got to be able to understand the historical oppression as well as what has been wiped out, so that we do not connect to this. I was so proud of a union in America called the ILWU, which was part of the boycotts during the mass boycott for the goods that were being shipped to South Africa. They stopped ships that were going to trade with the apartheid regime. But coming back a couple of years later, we had the union in South Africa, which is Limosa, which now stopped the ship going to Israel. So this is how I feel as people that are constantly, consciously trying to fight for our existence and our rights to be treated fairly like everybody else, to continue to link up with these struggles. I'm here today to say, okay, I may be a city councillor, but my life hasn't changed, because there is that feeling that for lots of people that I speak to, especially from African backgrounds, who understand the sort of social classification of who councillors are, who MPs are, that you probably hold some type of power. It's not the case. And we as people that are trying to show that kind of leadership, we can only rise with our people behind us. So my take on this is Black Lives Matter, where to Black Lives Matter really, it has to intensify, it has to intensify and grow in other sense, in a way that the Black consciousness movement try to liberate our minds by us understanding our history and really unifying as a class, as a working class. That has been really rubber stamped in me, especially when I'm in South Africa and observing what is happening on the grassroots in terms of how a lot of the young people who fought apartheid have been marginalized, and a lot of them have been, are on drugs and the destruction. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Jabu. And I just want to say something about Jabu, kind of pay tribute, because we might have all different ideas about, the prospects of achieving change through the Labour Party as a vehicle for that. Jabu's chosen to stay in the Labour Party and fight. And if we're talking about a hostile environment, that is a deeply hostile environment for anyone on the left in the Labour Party right now, anyone who's black in the Labour Party right now, and anyone who's just refusing to accept the way things are going, or if you're working class in the Labour Party even, and articulating that perspective. Jabu's all of those things. And the kind of amount of shit, frankly, she gets from within that hierarchical structure. And she's doing it not for some kind of career or grift or something, but because she feels she wants to represent people on her estate, and she's at the grassroots and they hate her for it, and she gets a ton of shit for it all the time. And so I just want to pay tribute for her sort of perseverance, really, in that. We both mentioned the threat of the threat from the council estates in the summer of 2020. I think that's really, sometimes we don't always see the significance of what's happening, even that we're involved in politically. Sometimes the state sees the significance and the threat before we do. And I think it's really interesting if we kind of put together what Sukant was talking about and Jabu. And here in Oxford, for the first time really that I can remember, we had actual en masse youth from the council estate coming on marches into the city centre, challenging the authorities, the council, Oxford University, and Oxford, it's a kind of quite a weak spot here in Oxford. If you think of England as like the belly of the beast, Oxford University is like, we call it like the brain of Lucifer in the belly of the beast. That's what it is, and it's quite a weak spot potentially. If you have en masse people confronting university power, how much it wouldn't have taken that much to just lead one of those marches into a middle of a college quad, fuck up those beautiful ironed lawns, and that'd be headline news. And they saw this threat of people like Sasha, who could actually mobilize en masse people from the estates to challenge the powers in the town. And and I think these last three, really since 2016, or like Stuart Hall since the 80s, but particularly the last 3 years since then, of reaction that we've seen, the growing far right, the police powers that have increased to be so vague that basically the government's telling the police, just do whatever you want, just don't worry about the law. We don't really have the rule of law anymore. I don't think we've taken on board the significance of the police powers that have been granted in the last few bills last year. The squat that was evicted a few days ago in London, they didn't, but it was completely illegal eviction. It was commercial property. It's not illegal to squat commercial property. It's a civil offence. You have to go through the court. The police didn't bother with any of that. They went in 40 riot police and just pulled everyone out. And that's the times we're living. The government is explicitly telling the police, just do that. That's what the meaning of these laws is. So it's new times really for that. I think it's not hyperbole that we're entering into a police state. But for me, just to before I open it up, I think the good side of that is that shows they are running scared, and it shows how kind of how much of a challenge there was potentially in 2020, and that will come back. That will have to come back, because the conditions that we're in are forcing us into another explosion like that. And it's just about kind of being as organized as we can to push that as far as we can the next time it comes. So yeah, let's just open up now to everyone. If anyone, any other reflections, comments on what's been said or anything. So I've got Kieran, seen Steve. Anyone else? Okay, quite a few. All right. So all right. Yeah, go ahead, Kieran.
Yeah. So it was a pleasure to help out with the Black Lives Matter movement as it emerged here in Oxford, and for the Community Association, we felt that it was incumbent on us immediately to offer everything we had, in fact, and to outlay money as well, so that this unprecedented expression of fury, but also the idea that we matter on the part of the young people from the estates and the neighbourhoods, for the first time coming out into the city, huge demonstrations, and the composition as well was fantastic, because the university had been closed for so long. The students were out of town, apart from some postgraduate students still in the city. So these huge demonstrations were primarily then the working class youth from the neighbourhoods in alliance with the local middle class youth and well-meaning people from the city. We'd never seen a black and Asian youth, well, a black youth especially, to come out, like Jabu said, and grab hold of the microphone. That was the most exhilarating thing. Took our breath away. That first demo, and then the marches, and then for the first time, because we've been losing so bad, like for the association, for example, the council had this neoliberal plan, and they were going to remove all, which they have done. They remove all our organising spaces and the possibility of grassroots groups, developing their own programmes in their own spaces in East Oxford. We knew that we were going to lose this battle with the council. They were going to take the centre away from us. And then all of a sudden there's this huge movement there with thousands of youth on the street, and the council and the university are running scared then. And the senior council officials and councillors are turning up to speak to us, like Alex Hollingsworth and Susan Brown have to come out and confront Sasha in the street. Sasha was fearless, absolutely fearless. I mean, regardless of what people might think about political positions that Sasha took, she provided a platform for those kids, and she encouraged them to step forward for the first time and express themselves. And that's what together the university and the council, they are scared of people power, genuine people power on the streets. Yeah. They start saying, we're going to make all these concessions now, and the university's falling over itself then to institute all these decolonising schemes in the university because of the sight of 5,000 youth, for the first time, some cross-class solidarity in Oxford on the streets, standing outside, demanding it. And then I felt now this is exciting. We've got the chance for change now. And then lots of ideas sprang up then, like Sukant said, was organised in London. A lot of enthusiasm then, a lot of creativity emerged because of that excitement. A lot of potential to work with then. We're not to organise it, to let it flower and express itself, to create a different situation in the town. But of course, as Dan said, we live here in the belly of the beast. It's an ancient place. They know they can wait us out, especially if you've got fascist. This government has instituted fascist policies, a result of everything that happened, that expression of agency. There's been the backlash because of the way that the youth behaved during the school strikes, the XR rebellions, and then the Black Lives Matter, and we've had this massive repressive authoritarian backlash to try and shut us down and forestall the possibility of that kind of mass enthusiasm on the streets again. But it's our only hope.
Thanks, Kieran.
To bring that back.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I was just want to say, like, I'd never seen anything like it in Oxford, like the gatherings in Blackford Leys Park and South Park and stuff. But where are all those people now? What, like, obviously mistakes were made because that energy, or like people have been saying, what could we have done differently to harness that energy in a more positive light and keep all those people politically engaged, or a higher percentage of them politically engaged?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, go ahead.
Just following on from that, that's where my thought process has been going as well. I mean, those events, they were just absolutely spectacular, and there was just so much energy and so much anger, but I think we missed a trick in that there wasn't an end objective or outcome. So there was lots of anger about the murder, but I think we missed something in keeping that energy and actually explaining. We have these conversations here, and there's a lot of information and there's a lot of background and stuff. And what you were saying was just, I'd like to know more. And I think that's what we're missing. We're not getting that message to the younger element for them to actually be angry about that. So they were angry about what happened, but then that anger fizzled because they couldn't see anything coming from that. Does that make sense? I'm not as articulate as
absolutely.
But it's just nothing came of it. So they got all the anger vented out, and then that's it. And I think that talk that you did, that needs to be in schools and in the community and whatever, because there's just so much there that people need to understand.
Yeah.
Okay. She had her hand up first, Carly.
Yeah. First, I don't think.
I wanted to offer a bit of a question, but also counterpoint from someone who is a student at the University of Oxford. I'm actually at Merton, where they just unveiled Stuart Hall's portrait, and it's a very interesting, weird thing to walk into the dining hall full of old white men and this new image of Stuart Hall, but when there's history lectures, nothing about Black.
He was a Rhodes Scholar, wasn't he, I think?
Yeah. Stuart Hall isn't included in any introductory history lecture. I didn't even know he was at my college until this was unveiled.
Which
and I went
college?
into Mob Library and saw all his manuscripts because Merton still owns them all, right? I can have access to all the things he even wrote when he was a student, his impressions, but that's not history, right? That's tagged on as its own thing. And I think what I want to reflect upon is something that you were mentioning. I'm sorry, I didn't know your name.
Debbie.
Okay, Debbie?
Yeah.
Okay, so what Debbie was saying is, I don't think that the anger of young people or students fizzled out. I think that's too passive way of looking at it. I think it was suppressed through a lot of these institutions that have active framing of DEI committees as the solution to decolonization, as anti-racist reading lists, as the solution to actual pragmatic problems. I can't tell you the amount of committees that I have to sit on and get volunteered for because I'm a brown woman and the only one in my department and the only one in the humanities division. I'm a visible other, but I'm one person, right? I think that what happens is, unfortunately, a lot of activism at the student level is an overburdening of the most marginalized communities who need the help, and then they become nihilistic because I sit here and I see bureaucracy over and over and over again not work. I see reform, I see the passing of new bylaws that are meant to make things better for students, and then I'm still sitting here on a disciplinary committee next week with a brown student being sexually assaulted. Who did it help, right? And I think that what ends up happening, the counterpoint, unfortunately, especially for undergrads at student level, who are only here for such a short period, right? You can easily be weighted out by the institutions. These institutions are here well after you graduate, is that they wonder, if I'm here for such a small period, why would I waste my time sacrificing my own mental health, right, for no change? I think it leads to a level of nihilism. And I think the real issue is the university is incredibly successful at insulating students who do care from the wider community. When I was at Race and Resistance, I think I might have seen you there yesterday, Jabu, when Professor Kelly was speaking. When we walked out, a lot of people had this reflection, which is, we come from institutions, like I come from a public university in the United States, where there isn't that same divide between the university and the people who live around it. So for example, when the Loyola White Knights, the KKK, marched through my university at UVA, I was a sophomore, and they had their tiki torches and all their like rifles and all of that stuff. And when we were protesting, it was the students, but it was also every Charlottesville resident that cared. And there was no division between students on one side and the Charlottesville residents on the other. We were all deeply integrated and we all knew each other. And you had friends who worked at coffee shops, you had friends who lived in the city. You weren't only friends with students. I come to Oxford and we just don't know community members, and I think that part of that is because the university makes it difficult to do that. Like, community members have to pay to enter university spaces.
Yeah.
When there are free university events, they're not advertised to community members, so only students show up, even though they're meant to be university-garnered events. The question that I have then is, if you want to have meaningful change, this is for both of you, like, how do you envision perhaps crossing that divide? Like, how do you perhaps take the energy that maybe still does exist but then gets suppressed and harness it, and how do you cross that between like students and members of the community?
Yeah, great question. I think let's just take some more and then you guys can come back. Go on, Barbara.
Femi.
Sorry, you know.
I'm just saying, put the bike there rather than in front of you.
Yeah, Femi, you can put your bike here, you know. Femi, you can put your bicycle here.
Put it here.
Oh, there's a bike rack, is there?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a bespoke bike rack. We made it this morning.
Yeah, go ahead, Barbara.
All right, okay. My name's Barbara. I'm from a group called the International Bolshevik Tendency, which is to say that I'm coming at this from a Marxist perspective. And thanks to Sukant and Jabu for these really valuable perspectives from two different angles. And it's interesting hearing you both talk about events, which I remember as well from another perspective. And I, like others, I remember how powerful that was standing in South Park. And part of it was in the middle of the pandemic. It was, people were being told to stay in our houses, but this was too important. And people came out, and I think it was probably the furthest I'd been from my house for quite some time, and people were coming out because this was important. And as people have said, they were a very different kind of person from that you normally saw on a demonstration in Oxford. And like others, I kind of think, what happened to those people? And the pandemic was part of that. I think it was very difficult to form a movement at that time where people were members and went to meetings and formed policy and built something. But I also think it is to do with something Sukant was talking about, which is the class divisions within the Black Lives Matter movement. And we've seen that with these grifters that have just taken the money and run, who are trying to, push Black Lives Matter, which was an angry grassroots movement, push it into this kind of bourgeois respectability. And I was thinking about the slogan Black Lives Matter, because it's an incredibly powerful slogan, because what the state says and what the ruling class say is Black lives don't matter. So it's very simple just to say, actually, these lives do matter. George Floyd's life matters. But at the same time, that slogan isn't enough. That's the starting point, that assertion. But what we actually need is a movement that challenges why that's the case. Why do Black lives not matter? And this is to do with the intersections of racism and capitalism, and how the state uses racism to divide us, to what Sukant was talking about the racial disparities of COVID, how the working class was divided into people who had to go to work and people who were locked into their houses, and the racial disparities there, and the disparities in the deaths from COVID, and all this.
I just want to chuck that word in there.
I was going to come to that, but yeah.
Still come to it.
Imperialism.
And these class divisions are in this movement, and it was really interesting that Jabu brought in South Africa, because I think we've seen the same thing with the ANC, which is a movement that again came out of resistance and anger, but again didn't challenge capitalism and instead just took over a capitalist state and managed it. And we see in South Africa so much still of the racism that was there before under apartheid, and it's the same here unless we actually challenge that system. And this involves class struggle within movements like Black Lives Matter, within the trade unions, within the Labour Party even, which is I disagree with Jabu that we should stay in it. I think it's capitulating to this entrenched class system that you talked about, and supporting that. And the trade union leaderships themselves are doing this as well, but we have to be in the trade unions, and we have to be fighting for the trade unions like the ILWU in California that Jabu talked about, which is a very integrated multiracial union that it was actually fighting racism as a working class movement, not just leaving it to the black people to fight racism, but actually as workers fighting racism. And we have to do that as well. So there's lots of complexities here about the way that racism and capitalism work together, and race and class, and we need resistance. We need working class resistance, and some of that is black led working class resistance, very much so. And but it's the history of all this. We've seen capitalism, it uses slavery, it uses colonialism, and yes, uses imperialism, the modern form of imperialism, to run this world system which is against the interests of all of us, and is deeply, deeply racist, but we fight it together as a class. Stop talking.
Thank you, Barbara.
Now,
Thank you. All right. Yes.
Yeah, just a couple of reflections. One is what happened to Sasha herself and the timing of that. Who knows? But we know the outcome, whoever the perpetrator. And in terms of...
So just a summary of what happened for people that don't...
Yeah, I don't remember what month it was in. Sasha was shot in the head at a party in London, in Southwark, and no one's ever spoken, as far as I know, about what happened that night. 4 people were arrested, 4 black men were arrested and then released, I think, without charge. And
The trial's shut down.
No, they were
at a high level.
Yeah.
The trial at a high level.
So, at the time of that was obviously energy sapping for any movement, and the extreme nature of that event, and sorry.
Yeah.
Actually,
You okay?
Yeah,
I don't even know Sasha. She had us sitting down on the bridge, on Magdalen Bridge. She had us sitting down in Cowley Road. She had 2 children, and she's still in hospital as far as I know. So there's an anger, but there's also a fear involved in that event. The other observation I have is there was a commercialisation, co-option of that anger.
Massive.
There were, Primark or whichever company had statements outside. There were the community sector in Oxford, statements, commitments. So there was a sort of a taking of that energy and a misuse of it. Making statements and commitments either with action points that never actually happened, or without action points. And I hasten to suggest, but the manifesto of Oxford City Council has 3 of the most feeble action points at the end of a massive document defining terms. I mean, it is actually quite extraordinary when you look at it in detail and with that lens. So I think that anger's still there. And I actually want to mention, although it doesn't relate directly to Black Lives Matter, the incident in Cardiff recently with the 2 young lads on the electric scooter.
It does relate.
I mean,
directly.
in terms of that, in terms of the time.
That's
period,
why you're mentioning it.
In terms of the time period. But that was a spontaneous explosion of anger from working class youth about...
It's the same stuff.
A really terrible incident. I don't know if I'm going to a bigger point other than that commercialisation has sapped something, I think, because now people roll their eyes if you say Black Lives Matters or if you refer to it, because it's like, that, and that the heart's still there, but it needs some other expression that doesn't get creamed off by other people.
Is it okay if I suggest that we come back and then we go around again? Unless people want to say something quickly, because there's just so much.
I feel like maybe we should hear from, because it's been a
sure.
while. Like, hear from everyone and then wrap up
cool.
with you two.
Me?
Yeah.
Hugo, Nigel.
Imperialism. That's all I wanted to say.
All right.
I think there's lots of more specific and relevant and articulate knowledge around here. I'm sure I could find something to say, but I'm much more happy. I'm learning and much more listening. I just wanted to say that I do have to pick up the food, though.
Yeah.
I just wanted to remind you that I have my car here.
Oh, in that case, you should go.
So I'll have to go on the bike.
Yeah, we're good. Nice one. Thanks, Hugo. Wait, I want to hear from people
More
who haven't
food.
spoken yet first.
This more food.
Yeah. Hot food.
Lovely.
So, anyone else?
Nigel.
Is that tentative hand over here?
What, me?
Yeah.
No.
Oh, it wasn't. Okay,
Sorry.
all right. Okay. Oh, Nigel, go ahead.
Just, I think because Stuart Hall's been mentioned, and so I think in relation to what everybody's been saying, policing the crisis, Stuart Hall, and if you think about sort of like the current legislation that's going through government, police crime bill, etc., Stuart Hall, policing the crisis, speaks to what's happening right here and now. Stuart Hall, common sense neoliberalism. Common sense neoliberalism relates to what Husha's been talking about in terms of like the whole co-opting and the commercialization, but the appropriation and the co-opting of sort of movement demands as well via the whole sort of common sense kind of process. And Stuart Hall again really captures that moment. Stuart Hall again in terms of neoliberalism, Oxford City, the role of the university, the land that the university has, the power, the money that the university has. Stuart Hall, 2011. A beautiful intervention from Stuart Hall. The long march of neoliberalism basically encapsulates that sort of intervention by Stuart Hall. Kind of looks at sort of the welfare state, the role of the welfare state, our conception of the welfare state, but our conception of the welfare state at a time of neoliberalism, privatization, outsourcing, basically the collapse of the welfare state. Basically Stuart Hall's kind of last intervention before he passed away in 2014 in terms of looking at the impact of austerity on communities right across the UK. 2011 then, Stuart Hall made that intervention 2011, juxtaposed with the uprisings, the youth uprisings, go back to policing the crisis. Stuart Hall.
In the 1970s.
2011, late 1980s. Yesterday, Robin D.G. Kelly, so Robin was talking yesterday, and after the session, Jabu and myself were talking with Robin Kelly, because he talked about the role of social democracy in terms of liberalism and social democracy, and then beautifully sort of like, linked liberalism and the role of liberalism to neoliberalism. And so classic liberalism vis-a-vis today's neoliberalism, but also the role of social democracy. So in terms of like our angst about the collapse of the welfare state, and Robin Kelly was saying you don't have any illusions in the collapse of the welfare state, because that's a process of social democracy. It's a long-running process in terms of like social democracy is never going to have the solutions for what's happening here and now. And so then after the session we talked about Stuart Hall and the Great Moving Right show. And Robin Kelly says, yes, you're quite right, Stuart Hall, the Great Moving Right show, and because that was an essay. So Robin riffed back that was an essay in Stuart Hall's The Hard Road to Renewal. Do you remember that? Basically, there's a collection of essays by Stuart Hall, his key writings basically his analysis of Labour and sort of like the growing fascisticization, the increase of fascism and authoritarianism in the UK, linked to the idea of a free economy, privatisation and outsourcing, and a strong state. And so the government that we have now is a further iteration of that process. So Stuart Hall mapped that process from the period that we call the late 1980s into the 1990s, and then he tracked it into New Labour as well. And so the hard road to renewal, and basically that's a critique of a left critique of social democracy, and the need to go beyond social democracy to challenge, to be able to kind of deal with neoliberalism as well. But a question that I have for everybody is that in terms of Black Lives Matter, because as well for me Black Lives Matter, there's the Oxford expression of Black Lives Matter, but you have to remember for me that Black Lives Matter, it's a global movement. And so if we're here saying that there was there's been a reduction in the activism around Black Lives Matter here in the UK and here in Oxford, still I think there's something about remembering that 2020 wasn't just about Black Lives Matter in the UK. 2020 was part of obviously George Floyd and what was happening in the States, but before George Floyd, 2020 was part of the global Black Lives Matter movement, and it was also linked, because remember, we haven't talked about the whole Roads Must Fall issue here in Oxford, and how that played out. And remember, Black Lives Matter in Oxford intersected with Roads Must Fall, and so people were marching about Roads Must Fall as well as marching about Black Lives Matter, the two connected. And then obviously as well, why a lot of people came out in the UK in relation to Black Lives Matter 2020 was just the disproportionate, the huge numbers of deaths of black and brown people to COVID-19. That was also that's also what fired up people, fired up the youth, fired up communities as well. But for me, in terms of the thing around resistance, and I think that because I think there's something around with youth, that somehow the youth that in the communities, you talked about youth in the estates, so then for me there's a question around how those youth are disenfranchised from political process by not just the mainstream parties, but the so-called left, in terms of, I think there's still this framing of youth on estates as lumpen proletariat, that they're not political, that you can't work with young people on estates. Remember, there's a whole issue about the whole kind of framing of chavs and all the rest of it, and then sort of like that fed into Starkey, and Starkey's thing of 2011, the whites have become black, the chavs have become too much like the blacks, and remember that time? But the whole framing of that was that, look, both black youth and white youth, those disenfranchised youth on the estates, that you can't politicise those youth, you can't work with those youth. No one was saying it because people don't use these terms now, but they mean the same thing. They're lumpen, they're the lumpen proletariat. You can't organise, and so that's why, like mainstream trade unions, mainstream political parties, they don't engage, they don't link with the youth. So I'm coming back to you now in terms of like your analysis, in terms of
waiting for the criticism, bro.
Yeah, I'm not. It's a question. I'm posing a question. Is the distance between activists and sort of like young people and communities on the estates, and I think part of it is still this perception that they're lumpen, they're not us, they're other.
They're not really the working class.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. They're not part of the working class. They're not part of the organised working class. They're not part of the labour movement that we can organise and
I'm
so.
desperate to bust some lyrics now. Don't let me stop you. Continue.
No. But Stuart Hall, yeah, there's much that needs to be done around Stuart Hall. Next year is unfortunately the 10th anniversary from when Stuart Hall passed away. So important to engage with Stuart Hall, especially for black and brown people here in Oxford. And a project that I keep talking about this project, a project that I really want to get going, is to revisit Stuart Hall. Massively contributed to the Perec Report 2000, the future of multi-ethnic Britain. And that report got trashed, got absolutely slammed by the mainstream media, by the Liberals, by the Social Democrats and New Labour. New Labour commissioned the report, but then just when they didn't like the message of the report, in terms of, because that report anticipated all these debates, all the passion, all the energy around decolonising the infrastructures, decolonising society, and it was Stuart Hall that contributed mostly to that historical perspective in that report, The Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain. So, that's a project that we're going to, Malcolm X Movement, Oxford Community Action, that we're going to get going in developing on the anniversary of Stuart Hall's passing away 10 years ago.
Is that name again?
All right, yes, go ahead, Femi.
Yeah, just off the back of what you were saying about Rosemus 4 intersecting with Black Lives Movement in 2020. I remember that, and there was a bit of a bubble down in terms of the energy afterwards on the Rosemus 4 front, and I thought I might rack my brain and try and remember one of my poems from the time that I did back in the Rosemus 4 days.
Oh, nice. I was going to ask you to do that, and I didn't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah. Cool.
Surrounded by opulence, 2.5 years I'd wandered through a city drenched in blood. The good and the positive I don't deny, but good and bad is never black and white, unlike Soweto. Architects of apartheid constitute the architecture of our institution. Architects of death, architects of murder, architects of killing, architects of looting, but that's in the past, right? It's history. We must not forget the empires of old. No, Rhodes was a man of his time. Now we're enlightened. A statue is mortar and stone. His bones in Rhodesia remain, along with his name, and Mugabe, who's nasty and cold. We're enlightened. We love free speech and democracy. Identity politics decays and corrodes. Rhodes, the last bastion of free speech, voted against positive discrimination in a full chamber. Explain to me how that's equality when there were 6 black students in the room out of 500. The vast problems that we face are erased. Class and race are ignored, and history today has its place. No, it ain't on the high street. The legacy of Rhodes lives in townships and boors, cause rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves.
Bun that down.
Britons never will be slaves, but we can own them. Christopher Codrington, slave owner, Britain. To the best of my knowledge, you'll find him in All Souls College on a statue in the library he built off the money he made off black bodies. Where's the guilt, please? Who needs guilt when you have dreaming spies and money? Lots of money, slave owners' money, Blavatnik's money, more money than many third world countries. The Oxford endowment is 5 billion. The Liberia's GDP too. The world is skewed. The pipeline from school to prison, the pipeline from Eton to the City of London. This is the latter. The funding we get is abundant. We're balling. It's wondrous. We're literally balling. Each week at a different college with different colonial artifacts and a different single-digit black intake. It's mad. It makes me sad to know that black lives don't matter at this institution. It makes me sad to know we then vote against moving towards a solution. Dreaming of a day when the hallowed halls of the institution I aspired to are more accessible to those who are not posh white from the southeast, with 2 brothers who have already applied to such institutions and got in. One at Christ Church, the other at Robinson's Cambridge. Blameless roommates at aristocracy. I've seen less Somalis than statues of Socrates, but the UK has the largest Somali community in Europe. Since the 19th century they've been here, and at Oxford I'd met a grand total of 3. Guess how many people I'd met from Westminster? Sinister. Even us that are here, too often privately educated. We're talking Eton, Tonbridge, children of princes, groundbreaking research and stifling privilege, built on the pillage of village and looting of land. We bury our heads in the dreaming spies. It's the city of dreaming, dreaming spies. Yeah, that's from back in the Rosemus 4 days.
like a good moment to maybe go back to before we
Can I
eat.
just say this? That of course the confluence of Roads Must Fall and Black Lives Matter turbo boosted Black Lives Matter in Oxford, because the Roads Must Fall has been in existence since 2016 in Oxford. And in the aftermath, when it was kind of fizzling out and we wanted to keep the demonstrations going, it was suggested that we set up an independent reparations commission in the city to try and bridge this gap between the two cities that are Oxford. There are two cities here, and they don't meet each other, like you say, Femi, all your colleagues, like most of them. I remember going up to Blackbird Leys, like with Nikki and you, yourself, and some of the others, and it was the first time most of you had ever been up there. I recall. You know, it's like, wow, this place is up here. I didn't know it's like another town. You know, but it needs local people, radical students. One big advantage of the Black Lives Matter movement was, having been in Oxford for 20 years, student activism really picked up in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter. And that, in fact, in the last 2 years, watching the student activism, this has been far more intense and active than it had been in the previous decade prior to the movement. It really was a big fillip for student activism in the town. But we need a reparations commission to consider these outstanding issues of history for justice now.
Thanks, Kieran.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who wanted to say something who hasn't spoken? Thinking about it?
Yeah, I don't have much more to add, just that like everything everyone said was super valuable, and I think like just I keep bringing it back to like other conversations we've had throughout the day, and like we were talking like 2 workshops ago about like this idea of like insurrection instead of revolution, and like stuff that's happened in France recently and happened in Egypt and stuff. And like like that's something I'm quite interested in, is like especially like the kind of work you've done with the Malcolm X movement, how you basically like how we move beyond just spontaneous resistance and move into revolutionary resistance, which needs to be organised and requires like another type of work. Like that's what I'm quite interested in.
Thank you. Anyone else? Friends over here at the back? Okay. Sisters here we haven't heard from?
Oh, well, I'm actually non-binary.
Okay.
I guess I wanted to speak Mariam Kaba's name as well, and like speak, just like mention that like police and prison abolition are really important horizons, and I think that was a really, really big takeaway from 2020, like seeing you know, one of the Minneapolis police stations like on fire was so powerful. And I think with what you were talking about in terms of, you know, activists who say like, oh, we can't connect with like the black youth working class, I think like there's a really good part in one of Mariam Kaba's pieces where she says like anyone who calls himself an activist is probably not necessarily going about it the right way. Like there is like activism as this sort of like self-centered, like, you know, like elite kind of like political class kind of thing, and then there's like ways to be organized and to get organized and to help organize others, and I think like that kind of like positioning is also important to always keep in mind.
Agreed. Thanks.
Thank you.
Brent, do you want to?
I just want to say I really enjoy what you were saying about how the idea that these black working class youth in our estates are like lumpenproletariat really means they have the most revolutionary potential, right? Like Fanon would say, like they're actually the most revolutionary subject, and I just thought that was cool, and that maybe they don't need the mainstream organising. It sounds like they didn't, right? I wasn't here in 2020, but it sounds like it was incredible.
That's because I think as well, and I think sort of in reflecting on Black Lives Matter and what next, is that if we think sort of it was the Black Panther Party in the US that again they were organising amongst the so-called kind of lumpen kind of proletariat, the black lumpen proletariat, but then in alliance, in coalition with other radical revolutionary groups, disenfranchised groups, stateside. But I think the difference between the Black Panther Party stateside and the lesson to learn from the Black Panther Party stateside is that they had, and I think this speaks to what we're saying about Mariam Kaba in terms of the survival programs the Black Panther Party was sort of like quite grounded in grassroots in terms of and serving the people in terms of the survival programs. And then I think that's a missing element in terms of from my perception and observation of the Black Lives Matter expressions in the UK, is that I don't think there are those similar sort of like grassroots community organising kind of efforts. And I think that's where Black Lives Matter in the UK is detached from the UK Black Radical history, because the UK Black Radical history of Black self-organisation has always been grounded. This is what the point that Sukan was making. Has always been grounded in grassroots community activism. So the Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent, Race the Day Collective, Dorcas Howe, John LaRose, New Beacon Books, Black Supplementary Movement, Black Parents Movement, Black Education Movement. They're all grassroots movements, self-organised, self-action, community organising. But I think that form of black self-organisation, that form of community organising, that form of black-led self-organisation is what's missing for me in the Black Lives Matter movement at the moment in the UK. And then also I think as well, if you look at Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness movement and Jabu, because with Lewis Gordon and Steve Biko initiated and was part of black community programs. So again, you had Black Panther Party survival programs, feeding the people, sickle cell testing, etc. And South Africa, black community programs with Steve Biko as part of the Black Consciousness movement. And the UK, Black Parents Movement, Black Supplementary Movement, the International Book Fair of Radical Black and Third World Books, John LaRose, and the Race Today Collective, all sort of organic grassroots community organising. And
I have to name check Bogle Overture.
And how could we miss and
the Huntleys.
And the Huntleys, Jessica and Eric Huntley,
the third in the triad.
Yeah, the Bogle Overture books, which gave us Walter Rodney's Our Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Groundings with My Brothers, which again, and Groundings with My Brothers speaks to the issue of class suicide in a way. Class suicide in terms of Walter Rodney. It did what Walter Rodney got
the library in my bag.
Walter Rodney got banned from my parents' country, Jamaica, because he grounded with the brothers and sisters in urban ghetto Jamaica, grassroots Jamaica. He bonded with the Rastas, so he came out of the academy. And went into the grassroots community, and
guerrilla intellectual.
Yeah, scholar activist, guerrilla intellectual, and which obviously speaks to what you were saying about Oxford in terms of the divide that many of the academics and the students, they don't bridge that gap, and it links to a debate that Bell Hooks had with Cornel West, Breaking Bread. And again, they were addressing this question stateside about, okay, look, there's a divide between us as black and brown academics in the academy vis-a-vis the local communities, and how do we break down that divide? And again, I think an overarching thing that has to be borne in mind in terms of is the whole kind of impact of neoliberalism. The impact of neoliberalism on so the difference that we have now, a key issue that we have now, different from the Black Panther Party, different from Steve Biko and the Black community program that Steve Biko had, is that you could sort of like say that they were organising in the period of late capitalism, and then we shift by late 1990s, collapse of the Berlin Wall, etc. We shift into the era of neoliberalism. And I think something to think about with Black Lives Matter UK, which is, I think, different elements have come in terms of people's talking points, is that with neoliberalism, there's been what Lester Spence calls, he refers to, he's got a title of a book called Knocking the Hustle. And the subtitle, so the book is called Knocking the Hustle, but what's the hustle? So the hustle comes from the subtitle. It talks about the black neoliberal turn, the black turn in the black neoliberal turn. So knocking the hustle against the black neoliberal turn in politics. And when you look at that book and when you look at what his analysis and what he's articulating, so he's looking at stateside and he says stateside, from the time of Reaganomics onwards, now into the 21st century, now into the 2020s, there's been a neoliberal turn in black politics. Yeah, and that's reflected in some of the stances taken by iterations of versions of the Black Lives Matter movement at stateside. Now, if you think in the UK, all this co-optation, all this kind of the neoliberalism that we have here, part of that, partly what feeds into that is here we've had a similar black neoliberal turn in the politics here, and that is an aspect of that obviously is the class dynamics, and like Stuart Hall said, race is the modality through which classes live, but most people just think of that in terms of Stuart Hall's, at the time he said that, he was again addressing this issue of why is it that the white left and white liberals kind of do not see the radical revolutionary potential of the black working class, that they're seen as lumpen. But like now, in the era that we're in now, in the neoliberal times now, you can also use that formula in terms of looking at intersections of race, class and gender, say actually, also we should not be in denial about the growth of the black middle class in the UK, and a black middle class that is quite strongly aligned to forms of neoliberal politics. And I think that's something that's not discussed in relation to Black Lives Matter UK. And I think you can see that in terms of forms of political formations now. The Black Equity, there's an organisation called Black Equity Organisation, and that may be an organisation, because obviously it's come out of the UK Black Lives Matter movement, but it's, in terms of its orientation, for me, there's questions about, is that orientation, it doesn't feel like a grassroots community black working class organisation and black working class led. It feels more like that's an organisation who's, in terms of its formation and its expression, is reflective of the growth of the black middle class in the UK. And then that links to the role of the black social conservatives that we see in government, the so-called most ethnically diverse government in the UK. Black social conservatives, black middle class.
Thank you, Nigel. Just before I hand back to Sukan and Jabu to kind of wrap up, two things I want to mention in case I forget. The next Malcolm X movement event in Oxford, scheduled for Tuesday, 20th of June in Blackbird Leys Community Centre. Very pleased to have George Shirey, veteran revolution freedom fighter, and also now scholar activist as well, scholar in his own right, emerged out of the freedom struggle in Southern Africa, being interviewed by some youngsters, teenagers, about reflecting on his experiences and kind of focus on sort of African liberation then and now. And what's the other thing I'm going to say? I've forgotten already.
Cake inside.
What's that?
There's free cake inside.
Yeah, well, there's a big barbecue about to set up here, so we're going to have to move away from the gazebo and the barbecue, hand over to Sukan to say, and then Jabu to say a few reflections on the discussion. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that, everyone. That was good. That was a solid hour of contributions from everyone. That's a really good conversation to go around. So a few words from me and then you, Jabu, if that's okay. Okay, so I'm going to go deep into this, right? Listen. Okay, so I've been reflecting on so-called skinheads against racism and anti-fascist action and all of this stuff, and also just, around the issue of a cultural critique that informs everything that we're talking about. And you can't be radical if you are culturally tagged to whiteness in any way, shape or form, you must be leaving whiteness immediately and constructing a new political and self-identity which is rooted and goes deeper and deeper into black liberation. There is no white-oriented struggle, and the only white-oriented struggle is a right-wing one and a counter-revolutionary one. You know, it doesn't matter what you are as you're racialized. It's about, this is, you know, we live our reality through culture. We live our relationships through culture. We live our politics through culture. We live our class consciousness through culture. So don't be coming at me with your fucking Antifa is the dog's bollocks. No, it's not. Don't be coming with me that Red Action and Anti-Fascist Action were the saviors of the fucking victims of racism in this community. They made a contribution, but we felt it and we fought back, and you fed into that, and that's fine and that's beautiful and that's lovely. But if you're going to still claim a whiteness, look where you fucking ended up. Anti-migrant, pro-Brexit. Gary O'Shea, the guru of Red Action, the guru of anti-fascist action, stands up in 2016, rails against immigration and immigrants, supports Brexit, and is a British nationalist. The point I'm making is that, and this pertains to a revolutionary spirituality and a revolutionary mysticism. I'm a dialectical materialist and a historical materialist. Doesn't mean I'm not going to understand the role of culture as it manifests. Jah Rastafari, right? I'm not going to underestimate that. I'm going to understand that you can only live a real human experience through a revolutionary spirituality. And what does that mean? It means being deeply, deeply, deeply invested at the grassroots that exist today and the historical intergenerational grassroots of the ancestors that came before us, because you can only understand yourself and who you are, what's the purpose of your existence today, if you understand all the many dozens and hundreds of ancestors who came before you. And the ancestors are telling you very directly, especially those who come from the former British colonies or any former colonies of any European power, that they have sent you here to finish the job off, to liberate the homeland from colonialism. And then they've said, go to the colonial center and burn it down, right? Jah Shaka says, God rest his soul, there is no reggae without black power. There is no reggae without black power. There is no culture without black power. Our entire culture is manifested on the sacrifice of the Vietnamese and the sacrifice of the black revolutionary people's struggle of the 60s. That's the reality. So let's go deeper into this. My entire political existence for nearly 30 years has been these forgotten, lost tribe called the underclass, the working class, in, where is it called? In Cardiff, in the suburb, where those two poor youngsters were killed. Ely. That community, Ely, to Handsworth, to Brixton, to Southall, to Notting Hill, to St Paul's, to Toxteth, to Blackbirdleys, one struggle, one people, one history. If you don't understand that, you don't understand class struggle on this island as it pertains for the last several generations. Let's go deeper into this. All my life, I've seen this working class, this true, veritable struggle of the working classes only be spontaneous and only be sold out. Only be spontaneous and only be sold out. I saw it when the kids were marching out of their schools around the time of the invasion of Iraq. Remember that? Tens of thousands of school children of all racialized backgrounds said they understood it as an injustice. They understood how this injustice, this, whereas Hugo is gone now, this imperialist injustice directly pertains to their own class interests, of how they're repressed and oppressed every day in the miseducation system in this country, to quote Lauryn Hill, right? They walked out, they were sold out by the left, the colonial left, the white left. And by that time, the black left became, just crumbled. Chinua Achebe, things fall apart. The 1990s, things fell apart. They fell apart. 1995, the last radical black and third world book fair. Yeah? And listen, the real histories of the grassroots, you won't hear them. You have to dig them out and do the hard work. What happened in the 90s? Not even half the story has been told about how things collapsed there. Darcus Howe, respect, but also a deeply problematic figure in this regards, right? Okay, so then let's go forward. Listen, I'm sick and tired of this shit. The most beautiful thing that exists on the revolutionary left is the very number one thing that the left never do in this country. And that's what you were talking about, bouncing off what I presented. Revolutionary serve the people strategies. Revolutionary serve the people strategies on the council estates has never even been attempted. We organized Culture Move in the early 2000s as university students, talking to the point that you particularly raised, right? How do you bridge this veritable apartheid that exists in our communities? It is a racialized apartheid that is there. It's right in front of our faces. It's not called that, but it is that. So we're like a campaign for free education amongst university students. How does this make any sense? It's a nonsense, because the people who need free education are people on the council estate on the other side of the motorway where our campus is on. And those kids hate students, and students have nothing to do with the local council estates. So we organized our resources, and we worked with thousands of young high school students, working class in East Sussex, organizing hundreds into workshops about understanding their own class position in their society in a cultural sense, to encourage them to articulate themselves, to actually, to express. And that's what happened in the summer of 2020. It was a sellout. Yes, the youth are angry still. They haven't gone away. You think they've gone away? You think they've stopped their consciousness? You think they've stopped living a working class existence? The only thing that stopped is that the left took some interest for a few moments in the summer of 2020 and then stopped taking an interest. You have to root yourself on a council estate. There's no other way to go. There's nothing else to do on the left. I mean, there's of course there's a diversity of things we're doing. This is not on a council estate, but it feeds into that radical culture as long as you're tapped into, directly connected to the grassroots as they exist. Listen, the youth, yes, of course some of the youth were, became alienated and they got scared and they stayed in their homes, and the white left were just behind their curtains inside during the lockdown. But let me tell you, the youth on the council estates in London were having block parties during the lockdowns. They were getting the barbecue out, they were getting the sound system out. They're saying, we're going to stop our social existence because of a lockdown, because the Tories are running this shit? No. You know what happened? Riot police was deployed. TSG was deployed. The footage is still there. The famous case in the White City Council estate where they got run out. The riot police got run out with a hail of bottles. There was resistance. This is all unwritten. No one's going to write these histories except people like the Malcolm X movement, who are partially in a direct experience. I'm going to finish off with this. That's the point. They haven't gone away. It's just that no one orients themselves to them. On the question of the Labour Party, I'm an absolute mortally opposed to the Labour Party. They have been massacring us for over a century globally. Some of the most notorious colonial massacres was done by the Labour Party. It's a rotten corpse of a colonial, disgusting organisation that is organised to deceive you and manipulate you back into the colonial centre and into colonial loyalty. Do I work with Labour Party people? Yes, I do. The Jessica Huntley Community Garden, supported by Rupert Huck, Labour MP. We don't take that support and therefore spin the Labour Party as anything what it is. It is what it is. It's part of the enemy camp, and it has to be opposed. I don't want to get diverted into that. I don't give a shit about the Labour Party, Couldn't give two shits about it, because it's absolutely useless for us. Listen, if something is radical, you know it's radical. August 2011, the uprising was radical. Summer of 2020 was radical. You know where the radical forces are. Let's not fool ourselves. Commit to them. Orient yourself to them. You are not the council estates, but you can assist people who work on the council estates, as we've started to do in Blackbird Leys, and as Nigel has done with his network, in a different kind of, but equally important strategy. Thank you.
Nice. All right. Jabu.
Just nice reflections, yes. Well, for me, really, as I said, my background is in the global struggle. So I I'm going to keep on pushing for people to really connect on those bases, because it's quite important to understand that one of the things that Kelly said, we're all living in corpse estates. We are all living in the same existence in terms of the powers that oppress us. So for us to kind of look at certain places as in isolation in terms of the struggle, unifying our struggles internationally is the best way to kind of approach what is happening in terms of capitalism and how all of us have been oppressed. The Black Lives Matter for me was symbolic of a really powerful movement that has existed. I mentioned the metrics earlier in terms of history re-downloading itself as far as our struggles are concerned. For us to find a formula, as most of you have talked about here, is to really recognize where to harness the power. You talked about the lumpen proletariat. As I said, I go around these estates and I say to myself, this is the real politics here. You know, I saw a woman about 2 days ago who got out, and I said, as a councillor, one of our sort of, it's almost like a script. Hi, I'm around in the neighborhood. Do you have any problems? And then you give the people their key to say what their problems are. And she began, actually I have this, I've actually got this, and then she turned around and said, I don't fucking like what's happening, and then talked about the council, talked about a much larger context. I mean, I spent almost 15 minutes talking to that woman, because that was a real education for me, and she understood talked about the ladders, talked about the food, what the food was doing to our community, the turning us docile. We are not, talked about the welfare system, the whole shitty bang. And that's a woman in Batin in an estate that she didn't articulate herself using the isms, but she talked about her everyday life. And I take solace from that. And some of them will turn around as soon as obviously I come with the labor banner, but some of them will turn around and say, when I say to them, I actually live on the estate, and you see the turning point, they say, well, actually we want to pay attention to you, because they recognize that there's somebody in their estate that's willing to challenge things from, okay, obviously most people won't approve of that way, but for me as a black woman, it's really, really important still to go to the city council and stand up and say, this is what is happening in the estate, this is what is happening in Batin, this is what is happening in Black Belize. Those connections for me are still quite important in terms of just basically saying, no, you are not speaking on behalf of these people. These people, this is how they are living. As for the international solidarity, again, I strongly recognize the impact of the anti-apartheid movement. It's my foundation in terms of who I am in England. I came here in the 80s at the height of the anti-apartheid movement, and I saw what it was able to do in terms of the boycott, the sanctions, the kind of movement that it produced to challenge what was happening in terms of apartheid. But even then, as young as I was, I used to actually recognize the fact that no, the people that were mostly in the anti-apartheid did not consist of everybody. It was always mostly the middle class people who were educated about different countries. At school, where I went to school, the young working class kids still, a lot of them thought that I basically got here to this country with no clothes on, and used to climb trees and Tarzan type of scenario. But it's really, really interesting that once we formed friendships with these young people, it was, they really connected in terms of the struggles of saying, look, poverty, what's going on, what was happening in their lives. Some of them were children that were living in abusive situations. So What I'm trying to say, as everyone has said, the working class is there. They're just waiting for us to connect with them. And I consider them to be the real working classes. And there are situations that I am really concerned about, especially around trade unions. The Unite Trade Union has got a community side, community-based union side, and then you've got the union is separate from the people who work, who pay their subs. I've had a situation in my life where I was in the community union and I needed the union to represent me, and they wouldn't, even though I had paid the subs. So those things, we need to question the unions about those things.
Universal experience.
Yeah. So and even though also I knew people that were in the unions who were now paying the full subs, they still felt that the unions didn't represent them. So we need to, challenge even the unions as to where is their loyalty. Why are they not, standing up for the people that are being discriminated against at work? So those are the things that for me are quite important, and also just to continue to say aluta continua. Aluta continua, everyone. If I say aluta continua, aluta continua. You say aluta continua. Aluta continua. Aluta continua. Aluta continua. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone.